She has been standing in the snow for 3 hours and 40 minutes, though time has lost its usual meaning in these months when days blur into one another through the fog of cold and hunger. The line stretches ahead of her for what might be 50 people, perhaps more, though it is difficult to count because the figures wrapped in layers of fabric and frost blur together into a single organism of waiting. Behind her, the line extends even farther, disappearing around the corner of a building whose windows have been blown out by artillery and now stare empty at the frozen street. The temperature is 28 degrees below 0 Celsius, recorded this morning by the meteorological station that continues to function even as the city dies around it. She cannot feel her feet anymore, which is both mercy and danger, because frostbite comes in silence and announces itself only through the blackening of flesh that will not heal. In her right hand, wrapped in a cloth that once was part of her mother's summer dress, she holds the ration card that represents survival for 3 people. The card is stamped with the current month's allocation, a bureaucratic grid of small squares that will be punched when she receives today's bread. The ration for dependents, which is what she and her sister and her mother are classified as, is 125 grams of bread per day. The ration for workers is slightly more, but her father, who was a worker, is gone now, having died in October during the first terrible weeks when the cold came early and the food reserves dropped below the level needed to sustain life. His ration card was confiscated immediately upon his death because the system cannot allow the dead to consume what the living desperately need. She remembers the official who came to collect the card, a woman younger than herself with eyes that held no emotion, who explained in a voice drained of inflection that failure to surrender deceased persons' ration cards constitutes theft from the state and will be prosecuted. The bread they will receive today, if the supply holds and if she reaches the distribution point before it closes, is not bread in the way that word meant before the blockade began. It is a substance composed of approximately 50% rye flour, 10% oilcake, which is the industrial residue from processing flax and cotton for oil, 10% cellulose processed from sawdust and wood pulp, 10% chaff and bran, and the remainder consisting of malt, soya, and whatever else the bakers can incorporate to add weight and volume. The mixture is dark brown, dense as clay, and tastes of bitterness and fiber. It crumbles rather than tears when broken, leaving residue on fingers that people lick carefully because waste is unthinkable. The bread causes digestive problems, stomach pain, and a peculiar sensation of fullness without nourishment, as if the body recognizes it is being filled with substance but cannot extract energy from what it receives. Still, it is food, or close enough to food to sustain life a little longer, and the alternative to having it is to join those who lie along Nevsky Prospect, covered in snow, no longer moving. She shifts her weight from her left foot to her right, a careful movement that requires concentration because balance becomes unreliable when the body has been burning its own reserves for months. She wore every piece of clothing she owns, layering them in the manner everyone has learned through shared experience. Closest to the skin, a thin cotton dress, then a wool sweater, then a coat that belonged to her father, then a blanket wrapped and tied with string, and finally a shawl over her head and around her face so that only her eyes are exposed to the air. The system works imperfectly because clothing designed for normal winter conditions cannot compensate for the absence of heat from within, the loss of the body's furnace that occurs when there is no fuel to burn. She has lost perhaps 15 kilograms since September, her body consuming itself to stay alive, burning through fat that is long gone and now working through muscle tissue that the body sacrifices reluctantly, preserving vital organs as long as possible. The woman in front of her in line has not moved for some time. She stands absolutely still, which could mean she is conserving energy or could mean she has died standing up, frozen in place in the position of waiting. This happens sometimes in the queues, the transition from life to death occurring so quietly that those nearby do not immediately notice. She watches the woman carefully, looking for the small movements that indicate continued life, the slight rise and fall of breathing, the occasional shift of weight, the periodic adjustment of clothing. After several minutes, she sees the woman's hand move to tighten the scarf around her face, and she feels relief that is immediately replaced by guilt for having allowed herself to imagine the line moving forward through someone else's death. The sound of artillery comes from the south, a distant percussion that has become the city's constant background music. The German forces occupy positions approximately 8 kilometers from the city center, close enough to shell Leningrad systematically but not close enough to take it through direct assault. The blockade that began in September has sealed the city almost completely, with only a route across frozen Lake Ladoga providing limited supply access. The Road of Life, as the ice route is called, carries food and medicine into the city and evacuates civilians and wounded soldiers out, but the capacity is insufficient for a city of nearly 3 million people trapped by enemy encirclement. The Germans do not need to attack. They can simply wait while starvation and cold accomplish what their armies could not. She tries to remember what it felt like to be warm, to sit in a room with a functioning stove, to feel heat radiating through clothing into skin and muscle and bone. The memory is difficult to access, as if it belongs to someone else, to a woman who existed before the blockade and who is no longer quite the same person standing in this line. The city's heating system failed in November when the power stations ran out of fuel and the pipes froze. Most buildings now maintain temperatures barely above the outside air. People sleep in their clothing under every blanket and coat they possess, sometimes sharing body heat with family members in a single bed. The elderly and the children die first because their bodies have less reserve and less ability to generate warmth. Her mother is 61, which places her in the vulnerable category, though she has survived longer than many younger people, perhaps through stubbornness or perhaps through random chance that no one can predict or control. Smoke rises from a few chimneys visible against the white sky, though most chimneys are cold because there is no fuel to burn. People have broken up furniture, burned books, torn apart wooden fences and floors, consuming anything combustible. The city's trees were cut down months ago. They were divided among those quick enough and strong enough to claim portions before the resource vanished. The parks that were green in summer are now expanses of stumps and snow, emptied of the life they once held. She remembers walking through the summer garden with her sister before the war, when the paths were lined with trees and flowers, when the world seemed constructed for beauty rather than survival. That memory too feels distant and implausible, like a story someone told her rather than something she experienced directly. Her sister is home now, lying in bed under layers of clothing and blankets, too weak this morning to stand in line. She gave up her place in the household work rotation last week, unable to maintain the energy needed to carry water from the public pump or to wait in queues for hours. The division of labor within the family has shifted repeatedly as different members have weakened. Her father performed the heaviest work until his death. Then she took over those duties while her mother and sister managed the household tasks. Now she performs all tasks because she is the only one with strength remaining, though that strength is diminishing and she knows her turn to become bedbound is approaching. When all members of a household become too weak to leave their beds, no one collects the rations and the household starves together. She has seen this pattern complete itself in neighboring apartments, has heard through thin walls the progression from movement to silence, has watched as officials came to collect ration cards from families who no longer needed them. The line inches forward, 5 people ahead of her reaching the distribution point and receiving their portions. She can see through the doorway now, see the workers behind their counter, see the scale where bread is weighed, see the stamps that will mark her ration card. The proximity to food creates a sensation in her stomach that might be anticipation or might be simply the organ's continued insistence that it exists and requires filling. Hunger has evolved through stages during the blockade. Initially, it was acute, a sharp demanding sensation that occupied consciousness and drove behavior. Then it became chronic, a constant background awareness that the body needed more than it was receiving. Now it has transformed into something else, a kind of emptiness that goes beyond physical sensation into existential territory, as if hunger has consumed not only her body's reserves but also parts of her personality and memory and capacity for feeling. She thinks about the bread she will receive, how she will divide it among 3 people, how she will resist the temptation to eat more than her share. The mathematics of ration division are simple but emotionally complex. 125 grams, multiplied by 3, equals 375 grams total. Divided equally, each person receives 125 grams. But her mother needs more because she is elderly and weakening. Her sister needs more because she is ill. She herself needs more because she is performing all the physical labor. The fair distribution is therefore impossible because everyone's need exceeds what is available. She has developed a system where she cuts the bread into 3 equal pieces and then allows her mother and sister to choose first, taking what remains for herself. This system creates the illusion of fairness, while allowing her to feel she has prioritized her family's survival over her own appetite. A man collapses further back in the line. She hears the sound of his body hitting the snow, a soft impact that others acknowledge by glancing back briefly before returning their attention forward. No one leaves their position to assist him because leaving the line means losing the place that represents hours of waiting. Someone near the fallen man leans down, speaks to him, tries to help him stand. She cannot see whether the assistant succeeds. The ethical calculations of the blockade are different from those of normal life. Helping a stranger risks your own survival. Conserving strength for your family means withholding it from others. The social bonds that held communities together have frayed under the pressure of scarcity and the biological imperative to survive. People who would have offered help automatically before the blockade now walk past the dying because stopping means consuming energy they cannot spare and feeling emotions they cannot afford. The woman in front of her receives her ration and moves away from the counter. She steps forward into the space left vacant. The worker behind the counter, a woman whose face shows the same emaciation as everyone else but whose position gives her access to slightly more food than those she serves, asks for her ration card. She unwraps it from the cloth and places it on the counter. The worker examines it, verifies the stamps, cuts 3 portions from the large dark loaves stacked behind her. Each portion is weighed on a scale, the worker adding small pieces or removing crumbs until the weight shows exactly 125 grams. The precision of this measurement, the careful attention to ensuring not a single gram more than allotted is distributed, reflects both bureaucratic discipline and the reality that supplies are calculated down to the smallest unit. The worker stamps the card 3 times, once for each ration, and slides the bread portions across the counter along with the card. The transaction is complete. She wraps the bread carefully in the cloth, tucks it inside her coat next to her body where it will not freeze into hardness before she reaches home, and turns to leave. The walk back to her apartment requires approximately 20 minutes at the pace she can maintain. Nevsky Prospect, once the grand avenue of Imperial Petersburg, is now a corridor of frozen silence. Buildings stand with broken windows, their facades pocked by shell damage. Trams have been abandoned where they stopped when the power failed, snow accumulating around their wheels and covering their roofs. Bodies lie along the sidewalk, some covered with snow, others recently dead and still visible as human forms. The city no longer has the capacity to collect and bury all the dead. They remain where they fell until spring when the ground thaws and mass burials become possible. She walks past them without looking closely because each body represents a story of failed survival, a family that lost someone, a person who could not endure another day. Looking means acknowledging, and acknowledging means feeling, and feeling requires energy she cannot spare. Her apartment building is 4 stories tall, constructed of stone in the previous century when Leningrad was still Petersburg and was the capital of an empire that no longer exists. The stairwell is dark because the windows have been covered with boards after the glass was blown out by a nearby shell impact. She climbs the stairs slowly, pausing on each landing to rest and catch her breath. Her apartment is on the 3rd floor, the door marked with a small card that lists the names of residents so that officials delivering notifications or collecting ration cards know who lives where. She removes her gloves, which takes effort because her fingers are stiff with cold, and unlocks the door with a key she keeps on a string around her neck. The apartment interior is nearly as cold as the outside air. The windows are covered with blankets to preserve whatever warmth might accumulate, and to protect against glass if shells land nearby. The main room contains a table, several chairs, and a bed where her mother and sister have been lying under shared blankets. She calls out greeting as she enters, announcing that she has returned with the rations. There is no response. She walks to the bed, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtered through the covered windows. Her mother lies still, her face peaceful, her hands folded on her chest. Her sister lies beside her, also motionless. She reaches out to touch her mother's hand and finds it cold, colder even than the ambient temperature, cold with the specific quality that indicates absence of life rather than merely absence of warmth. She stands beside the bed for a time that could be minutes or could be longer, holding the bread wrapped in cloth against her chest. The bread is still slightly warm from her body heat, a fragile temporary warmth that will dissipate when she sets it down. She understands that her mother and sister died while she was standing in line, that the 4 hours she spent waiting and walking were hours they did not survive, that the rations she carried home will not fulfill the purpose for which she obtained them. The understanding arrives without accompanying emotion, not because she does not care but because grief requires energy and presence of mind that malnutrition has depleted. She feels instead a kind of hollow recognition that the trajectory she has watched other families complete has now completed itself in her own family, that she is now the last one, that tomorrow she will need to surrender 2 ration cards to the officials and will receive only one person's portion. She unwraps the bread and places it on the table. 3 portions, each exactly 125 grams, arranged in a row. She had planned to divide them, to give one to her mother, one to her sister, to keep one for herself. The plan is now irrelevant, but the bread remains, physical and real, the result of hours of waiting and walking. She picks up one portion and eats it slowly, making each bite last, chewing thoroughly though the bread's texture makes that difficult. The taste is bitter and the texture is dry, but it fills space in her stomach and that is sufficient. When she finishes the first portion she considers the other 2. By the regulations, she should not eat rations allocated to the deceased. She should surrender the ration cards first, then receive only her own allocation. But her mother and sister are not yet officially deceased because no officials have been notified. and the rations have been obtained under their cards while they were still alive, even if barely and not for much longer. The distinction matters legally, though it may not matter practically. She wraps the remaining 2 portions carefully and places them in the small cupboard where food is stored. She will eat them tomorrow and the next day, extending her own survival by 48 hours through bread that was meant for others. The ethical complexity of this choice is something she no longer has capacity to fully consider. She is tired in ways that sleep cannot address, tired in body and mind and spirit, tired of being cold and hungry, tired of watching people die, tired of continuing when there is no clear purpose to continuation beyond the biological drive to persist. She lies down on the bed beside her mother and sister, pulling the blankets over all 3 of them, aware that their bodies will provide no warmth but finding some comfort in proximity nonetheless. Outside the covered windows, the afternoon light fades toward evening. Artillery sounds in the distance, the same rhythm that has punctuated every day for months. Somewhere in the city, other people stand in other lines, waiting for rations that may or may not be sufficient to sustain them through another night. Somewhere officials calculate remaining food supplies and debate whether to reduce rations further or to maintain them at current levels for a few more weeks. Somewhere German commanders observe the city through binoculars and discuss how much longer the siege must continue before Leningrad surrenders or starves into silence. The machinery of war and survival continues operating according to its own logic, indifferent to individual stories of loss and endurance. She closes her eyes and tries to sleep, though sleep comes unreliably these days, interrupted by cold and hunger and the body's distress at its own consumption. She thinks about her father, about how he died in October before the worst of the winter, about whether that was mercy or tragedy. She thinks about her mother and sister lying beside her, about how they survived longer than many but not long enough to see spring. She thinks about the bread in the cupboard, about whether she should eat it tomorrow or ration it more carefully across several days. She thinks about what happens when the bread runs out, whether she will have strength to stand in line again, whether there will be more rations to distribute or whether the supplies will finally be exhausted and the city will simply stop. The blockade of Leningrad will continue for another year and a half, through the winter of 1942 and into 1943 and finally ending in January 1944 when Soviet forces break through German lines and establish a reliable supply corridor. By that time, approximately 1 million civilians will have died from starvation, cold, and the diseases that prey on weakened bodies. The siege will be remembered as one of the longest and most destructive in modern warfare, a demonstration of what happens when military strategy prioritizes starvation over direct combat, when cities become battlefields and civilians become casualties not through accident but through design. The woman lying on the bed will be among the statistics, one number in the million, one name in the lists of deceased that will be compiled after the war when officials attempt to account for who was lost and how. But that accounting lies in the future, beyond the reach of her present awareness. Now there is only this room, this bed, these blankets, this cold, this hunger, this exhaustion that may be the beginning of the transition from life to whatever comes after. The bread is in the cupboard. The bodies of her mother and sister lie beside her. The city holds its breath in the frozen darkness, waiting for morning, waiting for spring, waiting for relief that seems less probable with each passing day. She breathes slowly, each breath a small victory over the cold that wants to still all motion. She does not think about tomorrow because tomorrow requires hope, and hope is a luxury like heat or sufficient food, something that belonged to the time before the blockade and may not survive into whatever time comes after. She simply breathes, and that is enough, or must be enough, because nothing else remains.